Creatures such as the Vorak possess bioelectric fields so intense that proximity alone can induce psychosis in sentient beings. Physical contact results in immediate neural collapse. They are classified as apex predators for a reason. Dr. Voss. High Counselor Terra's words echoed in the vast council chambers as she stared down at the lone figure standing before the curved dais. Her voice carried the polished authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the labyrinthine politics of the Galactic Confederation. Dr. Kestra Voss maintained her composure despite the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her. Representatives from 47 species filled the chamber's tiered seating, their murmurs creating an undercurrent of disapproval. "With respect, High Counselor," Voss replied, her voice steady. "The Vorak have never attacked a Confederation vessel. The psychosis reported by early explorers occurred because we approached them with electromagnetic shielding that distorted their communication attempts." An audible scoff came from the Rilturian delegation. Their ambassador, a tall being with iridescent scales, leaned forward. "Communication attempts, Dr. Voss. The Rilturian science vessel Astarte lost its entire crew to madness when it passed within half a light-year of Vorak space. The survivors spent the remainder of their lives in psychiatric facilities. That was no attempt at communication." Voss had anticipated this argument. She tapped her neural interface, projecting a holographic display for all to see. "The Astarte incident occurred 73 years ago. Their shielding technology was designed to block gamma radiation, not manage bioelectric fields. What they interpreted as an attack was the equivalent of someone shouting into your auditory canal when you expected a whisper." High Counselor Terra's expression remained unmoved. "Dr. Voss, you stand before this council requesting permission to enter a quarantine zone established for the protection of all Confederation citizens, to make direct contact with a species universally classified as an apex predator. You wish to do this based on pattern recognition in noise?" "Not noise," Voss insisted, enlarging a section of her data visualization. "Structure. These are not random discharges. There are repeating sequences here, here, and here." She highlighted sections of the waveform. "This is language, just not one we've been equipped to understand." The chamber erupted in dismissive chatter. Dr. Voss had grown accustomed to this reaction during her 15 years at the Terran Institute for Xenobiological Studies. Her theories about bioelectric communication had relegated her to a cramped laboratory in the Institute's basement level, and earned her a reputation as brilliant but unhinged. "Silence," commanded Terra, and the chamber obeyed. "Dr. Voss, even if your theory held merit, the risk is unconscionable. The Vorak quarantine exists because direct neural contact has proven fatal in all documented cases." "All 7 documented cases," Voss corrected, "which occurred before we understood the nature of bioelectric shielding. My modified neural interface can modulate the incoming signals to safe levels while preserving their structure." "You've tested this?" asked Terra, her skepticism evident. "On simulated Vorak emissions, yes." "Simulations," Terra sighed, exchanging glances with her fellow council members. "Dr. Voss, the Confederation exists to protect its citizens from exactly this kind of reckless endangerment. Your petition to enter Vorak space is denied." Voss had prepared for this outcome, but the finality still stung. She gathered her materials, her mind already formulating alternatives. As she turned to leave, a voice rose from the second tier of the chamber. "Point of procedure, High Counselor." The chamber's attention shifted to Commander Zoran of the Terran Scientific Fleet. His weathered face bore the deep creases of someone who had spent decades in zero-gravity environments. Voss had never met him, but his reputation preceded him. A decorated commander with an impeccable safety record and a surprising penchant for supporting unconventional research. "The Council recognizes Commander Zoran," Terra replied with evident wariness. "Section 47.3 of the Confederation Charter permits scientific expeditions into quarantine zones, under strict protocols, if the mission serves the greater knowledge of the Confederation. His voice carried the crisp precision of military training. I have already received authorization from Terran Command for Deep Space Research Expedition 847, a general survey mission that happens to pass near Vorak space. Dr. Voss's research could be accommodated as a secondary objective, provided proper safety measures are observed. Voss struggled to mask her surprise. She had applied for dozens of expedition berths over the years, all rejected due to the controversial nature of her research. High Counselor Terra's mouth tightened. Commander Zoran, are you volunteering to take responsibility for the potential catastrophic consequences of Dr. Voss's theories? I'm volunteering to uphold Confederation principles of scientific inquiry within established safety protocols. Zoran replied smoothly. My vessel, the Intrepid, exceeds all safety requirements for proximity to Class Alpha quarantine zones. Dr. Voss would conduct her research from within our most heavily shielded laboratory compartment. A silent battle of wills played out between Terra and Zoran. Finally, the High Counselor spoke. The Council will permit Dr. Voss's inclusion in your expedition under the strictest adherence to quarantine protocols. She is not, I repeat, not authorized for direct contact with Vorak entities or descent to the Vorak homeworld. Is that understood, Commander? Perfectly. High Counselor. Zoran inclined his head in a gesture of respect that somehow managed to seem both sincere and ironic. As Voss departed the council chambers, she found Commander Zoran waiting in the antechamber. His actual presence was more imposing than the holographic projections she had seen in news feeds. Tall, with the characteristic leanness of someone who had spent much of their life in space. His gray hair was cropped short in military fashion. Dr. Voss, he greeted her, extending a hand. I've followed your research for some time. Voss accepted the handshake, studying him cautiously. That's surprising, Commander. Most military personnel dismiss my work as academic fantasy. A slight smile creased his face. I've spent 40 years exploring spaces others deem too dangerous or worthless to investigate. In my experience, the Confederation's apex predator classification often says more about our fears than the species in question. Why support my inclusion on your expedition? It won't earn you any political capital. Zoran's expression grew serious. Because in 40 years of space exploration, I've learned that the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't some bioelectric alien. It's ignorance. Your theory may be wrong, but the only way to know is to test it. Besides, he added with a hint of mischief, the Intrepid departs in 3 days, just enough time for you to prepare your equipment. Despite her best efforts, Voss felt a surge of hope. After 15 years of theoretical work, she would finally have the chance to test her hypothesis. I'll be ready, she promised. 3 days later, Dr. Kestra Voss stood in the cavernous launch bay of the Terran Scientific Fleet headquarters, watching service drones load her equipment onto a shuttle bound for the Intrepid. The gleaming research vessel hung in orbit above Earth, visible through the massive bay windows as a bright point against the blackness of space. Kestra, wait! She turned to see Dr. Yelan Koresh hurrying across the bay, clutching a data tablet. As the Terran Institute's leading xenolinguist, Koresh had been one of the few colleagues who hadn't openly mocked Voss's research, though his skepticism had always been evident. Yelan, what are you doing here? Koresh arrived at her side, slightly breathless. Coming with you, apparently. I received orders this morning. Commander Zoran requested a linguist to assist with your research. Voss blinked in surprise. That's unexpected. That's one word for it, Koresh replied, his expression a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I've never been outside the Sol system before, and now I'm headed to the edge of Vorak space. He lowered his voice. You really believe they're trying to communicate? I know they are, Voss said, with the quiet certainty that had sustained her through years of academic isolation. The patterns are too consistent, too structured to be random discharges or simple predatory lures. Koresh ran a hand through his close-cropped hair. Well, I've brought everything I could think of. Comparative linguistics databases, pattern recognition software, even some of the experimental symbolic translation algorithms we've been developing. Thank you, Voss said, genuinely moved by his thoroughness, despite his obvious reservations. Having a linguist on board will be invaluable. Dr. Voss! Dr. Koresh! A uniformed officer approached. Commander Zoran sends his apologies. He's been detained by a last-minute briefing with Fleet Command. He asks that you board immediately. We depart in 30 minutes. As they followed the officer to the boarding shuttle, Koresh whispered, Did you know Professor Venth is also joining the expedition? Voss stopped short. Hedrick Venth, from the Terran Institute? Koresh nodded. Appointed as scientific overseer. Apparently, the council insisted on having someone to keep an eye on the mad scientist, Voss finished, her momentary elation dampening. Professor Hedrick Venth had been her most vocal critic at the Institute, dismissing her theories as mystical thinking dressed in scientific terminology. His presence would complicate everything. The shuttle journey to the Intrepid passed in tense silence. When they docked with the research vessel, Commander Zoran was waiting to greet them, accompanied by Professor Venth, whose tall, angular frame and perpetual expression of disdain made him instantly recognizable. Dr. Voss, Zoran said warmly, welcome aboard the Intrepid. I trust your equipment has been transferred without issue? Yes, Commander, thank you. Professor Venth has kindly agreed to serve as our mission's scientific authority, Zoran continued, his tone giving nothing away about his feelings on the matter. At the Council's request, Venth added pointedly. Someone needs to ensure that enthusiasm doesn't override safety protocols. Voss met his gaze evenly. I've never advocated for ignoring safety protocols, Professor, only for revising them based on new data. Data which has yet to convince the broader scientific community, Venth replied. Commander Zoran intervened smoothly. We have a 9-day journey to the perimeter of Vorak space, which should give us ample time for scientific debate. For now, I suggest you all settle into your quarters and familiarize yourselves with the ship. We break orbit in 2 hours. As the group dispersed, Zoran briefly touched Voss's arm. My apologies for not warning you about Professor Venth. His appointment was a condition of our departure approval. I understand, Commander. Zoran, please. And don't let Venth intimidate you. This is still a Terran fleet vessel under my command. Your research will proceed as planned, with all due safety measures. Voss nodded gratefully. Thank you, Zoran. The 9-day journey to the edge of Vorak space proved both shorter and longer than Voss had anticipated. Shorter because she spent every waking moment in the Intrepid's well-equipped laboratory, calibrating her equipment and running simulations. Longer because of the constant scrutiny from Professor Venth, who insisted on reviewing every aspect of her experimental design. Your modified neural interface, Venth said on the 5th day, examining the delicate circuitry with evident skepticism. You've tested this on actual bioelectric fields of comparable intensity. On simulations calibrated to the highest recorded outputs from Vorak space, Voss replied, maintaining her patience through practice discipline. Simulations, Venth echoed, his tone dismissive. And if the actual fields exceed your simulations? The interface has a failsafe that severs the connection if input exceeds safe parameters. Assuming the failsafe works before your brain chemistry is permanently altered. Dr. Koresh, who had been quietly working at a nearby console, interjected. Professor, I've reviewed Dr. Voss's data. The pattern recognition algorithms identify structural similarities to known communication systems with 87% confidence. Pattern recognition in chaotic systems often produces false positives, Venth countered. We see faces in clouds, Dr. Koresh. It doesn't mean the clouds are trying to talk to us. Before Koresh could respond, the ship's intercom activated. All scientific personnel to the bridge, came Commander Zoran's voice. We are approaching the perimeter of Vorak space. The Intrepid's bridge was a model of efficient design. Curved view screens provided a 180-degree view of the space ahead, currently showing nothing but distant stars against the black void. Zoran stood at the central command station, studying holographic displays of sensor readings. Ah, perfect timing, he said as the scientists entered. We'll be crossing the quarantine boundary in approximately 17 minutes. I wanted you all to observe the transition. Voss moved to one of the sensor displays, watching the readings with rapt attention. Are we detecting any bioelectric activity yet? Nothing above background levels, replied the sensor officer. We're still well outside the range where previous expeditions reported effects. Professor Venth positioned himself beside Commander Zoran. I remind you, Commander, that Confederation protocols mandate a full withdrawal at the first sign of crew psychological distress. I'm familiar with the protocols, Professor, Zoran replied evenly. We'll maintain position at the perimeter for 24 hours, allowing Dr. Voss to collect her data from a safe distance. No further penetration into Vorak space is authorized. Voss knew that the perimeter observations would be insufficient to prove her theory. The bioelectric fields weakened exponentially with distance. She needed readings from much closer to the Vorak homeworld. But this was a start, her first chance to collect real data rather than rely on the fragmented reports of previous expeditions. Crossing quarantine boundary in 3, 2, 1, mark, announced the navigation officer. Nothing visibly changed on the view screens, but Voss felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere on the bridge. Several crew members straightened in their seats, glancing around as if hearing distant sounds. Bioelectric field readings? Zoran inquired. Rising slowly. Commander. Still well within safe parameters. Voss activated her neural interface, allowing a tiny fraction of the incoming fields to reach her consciousness through carefully modulated filters. Immediately, she sensed it, a faint rhythm pulsing at the edges of perception, like music heard through thick walls. There's structure, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Definitely structure. Dr. Voss? Zoran's voice seemed to come from far away. She blinked, realizing she had become momentarily lost in the sensation. I'm fine. The fields are exactly as I predicted, coherent, not random. The patterns repeat at intervals of approximately 5.7 seconds. I'm not detecting any pattern, said Professor Venth, studying the raw sensor data. Only standard fluctuations consistent with stellar interference. The pattern exists in the relationship between multiple field layers, Voss explained, transferring her interface readings to the main display. Here, and here. They're phase-locked in a way that couldn't occur naturally. Koresh moved closer to the display, his expression thoughtful. That is interesting. It resembles some of the syntactic structures we've observed in non-linear communication systems. Commander Zoran watched the exchange with interest. Dr. Voss, how long will you need to collect sufficient data from this position? At least the full 24 hours, she replied. But, Commander, to truly validate my theory, we would need to move closer. The signal-to-noise ratio at this distance makes detailed analysis challenging. Absolutely not, Professor Venth interjected. The quarantine boundary was established based on documented psychological effects. Moving closer would endanger the entire crew. Professor Venth is correct, Zoran said firmly. We will maintain position here for the authorized observation period. Dr. Voss, make the most of the data you can collect from this position. Voss nodded, hiding her disappointment. She had expected this response, but had hoped that the initial readings might persuade Zoran to bend the rules slightly. She would have to work with what she had. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of data collection and analysis. Voss remained in the laboratory, her neural interface carefully processing the incoming bioelectric fields, while Koresh attempted to apply various linguistic, analytical models to the patterns she identified. "The complexity is remarkable," Koresh admitted as they reviewed their findings. "There's definitely a hierarchical structure here that resembles language, though unlike any I've encountered before." Professor Venth, who had been monitoring their work with increasing frequency, scoffed. "You're seeing what you want to see. These patterns could easily be explained by natural phenomena, interactions between the Vorak star's magnetosphere and the planetary field. That wouldn't account for the nested repeating sequences," Voss countered, highlighting a section of the data. "Look here. This exact sequence has appeared 14 times in the last 12 hours, always preceded by this other sequence. That suggests intentionality." Their debate was interrupted by a shipwide announcement. "Attention all personnel. This is Commander Zorin. We are detecting increased bioelectric activity from the direction of the Vorak homeworld. All crew are advised to report any unusual psychological symptoms immediately." Voss checked her instruments, noting the dramatic spike in field intensity. "Something's changed. The fields are becoming more focused, more directed." "Directed at us?" Koresh asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice. "I think they've noticed our presence," Voss replied, excitement overriding caution. "This could be a deliberate attempt to establish contact." Professor Venth moved swiftly to the communication panel. "Professor Venth to Commander Zorin. I strongly recommend immediate withdrawal from Vorak space. The increase in field intensity matches patterns observed before the Astarte incident." "Acknowledged, Professor," came Zorin's reply. "We are already preparing to depart. All scientific personnel, secure your equipment for high-velocity transit." "Commander, wait," Voss protested. "This is exactly what I've been waiting for. Direct communication attempt. My neural interface is handling the increased intensity without difficulty. We need to stay and respond." "Dr. Voss, I understand your enthusiasm, but I have the safety of the entire crew to consider. The decision is made. We depart in 30 minutes. Voss turned to Koresh, desperation in her eyes. "Yilan, you've seen the data. Tell me you don't recognize communication patterns in these fields." Koresh hesitated, glancing between Voss and Venth. There is something structured here. But Kestra, the intensity is increasing exponentially. We don't know what prolonged exposure might do, even with your interface." "Fine," Voss said quietly. "Help me save as much data as possible before we leave." The next 20 minutes were spent downloading and backing up their observations. As Voss was transferring the final data sets, she noticed something alarming on the sensor readings. The bioelectric fields were no longer simply increasing in intensity. They were changing in structure, becoming more complex, more urgent. She made a split-second decision. "I need to use the restroom before departure," she told Koresh. "Finish the backup for me?" "Of course," he replied, focused on the data transfer. Instead of heading to the restroom, Voss moved swiftly through the corridors of the Intrepid toward the shuttle bay. Her plan had formed during sleepless nights over the past week, a contingency she had hoped wouldn't be necessary. The small research shuttle she had noticed during their boarding was designed for short-range planetary surveys, perfect for a quick descent to the Vorak homeworld. The shuttle bay was minimally staffed as the crew prepared for departure. A single technician looked up in surprise as Voss entered. "Dr. Voss, this area is restricted during pre-departure procedures." She gestured to her neural interface. "Commander Zorin requested last-minute field readings from a different angle. I need to take the research shuttle out for a brief circuit." The technician frowned. "I don't have authorization for that in the system." "Check again," Voss said confidently. "It was just issued." While the technician turned to his console, Voss swiftly pressed her interface against the security panel, transmitting the override codes she had carefully extracted from the ship's systems during the journey. The panel flashed green. "Oh," the technician said, surprised. "There it is. Just came through. You're authorized for a 30-minute survey pattern, no more." "Perfect, thank you." Minutes later, Voss sat at the controls of the research shuttle as it detached from the Intrepid. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline sharpening her senses. What she was doing violated every Confederation protocol, risked her career, and potentially her life. But after 15 years of theoretical work, she couldn't turn back now, not when she was so close to proving her hypothesis. The shuttle's communication system crackled to life. "Research Shuttle 1. This is Commander Zorin. Return to the Intrepid immediately. That's an order." Voss took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Commander. The bioelectric patterns have shifted. They're responding to our presence. I can't walk away now." "Dr. Voss, you are in violation of direct orders and Confederation quarantine law. Return immediately or face severe consequences." "The consequences of missing this opportunity would be far worse," she replied, then muted the communication system. She plotted a course directly toward the Vorak homeworld, a pale blue-green sphere growing larger on her view screen. As the shuttle accelerated, she felt the bioelectric fields intensify around her, even through her neural interface's careful modulation. The sensation was overwhelming, like standing in the surf as massive waves crashed around her. The shuttle's systems began to flicker as the fields interfered with its electronics. Warning lights flashed across the control panel. Voss ignored them, focusing instead on the patterns she could sense through her interface. There was a rhythm to them now, a clear structure that reminded her of conversation, questions, and pauses, as if waiting for responses. Her neural interface chimed a warning as the field intensity approached its safety threshold. Voss overrode the failsafe, increasing the filtration while still allowing the essential patterns through. The sensation changed, becoming less chaotic, more focused, as if the source of the fields was adjusting to her presence. The Vorak homeworld filled her view screen now. Unlike most habitable planets, it showed no signs of technological civilization, no lights on its night side, no artificial satellites, no transmission signals. Yet, it was far from lifeless. The sensors detected massive energy fluctuations across its surface, concentrated in what appeared to be vast living structures, rather than cities. As the shuttle entered the upper atmosphere, the communication system suddenly reactivated itself. "Repeat, Dr. Voss, if you can hear us, abort your descent immediately. Confederation emergency fleet has been dispatched. Your neural interface cannot withstand prolonged exposure to field intensity at planetary levels." It was Dr. Koresh's voice, strained with concern. Voss felt a pang of regret for having deceived him, but remained resolute in her course. "I'm receiving you, Yilan," she replied. "The interface is holding. The fields here, they're incredible. There's communication happening on multiple levels simultaneously. It's like a symphony of thought." "Kestra, please," Koresh pleaded. "Even if you're right, this isn't the way. We can return with better equipment, proper authorization." "We both know that would never happen," Voss interrupted gently. "Not after this. This is my one chance. I have to take it." She guided the shuttle lower, following the strongest concentration of bioelectric activity. The planet's surface came into view, rolling plains of what appeared to be some form of bioluminescent vegetation, surrounding vast, pulsating structures that defied easy classification. They weren't buildings in any conventional sense, but rather massive, semi-transparent formations that seemed to shift and flow like living tissue. The shuttle's engines suddenly cut out as it passed through an intense field node. Voss felt a moment of panic as the craft began to descend rapidly, all systems offline. Then, as suddenly as they had failed, the engines reactivated. but not under her control. The shuttle changed course, guided by an external force toward one of the largest structures on the surface. Through her neural interface, Voss sensed a change in the bioelectric patterns, a focusing, a deliberate communication directed specifically at her. Her modified interface translated the patterns into conceptual impressions rather than words. Curiosity, examination, welcome. The shuttle landed gently on a flat area adjacent to the massive structure. Through the viewports, Voss could see the surface moving, rippling like water as something approached. Her heart raced, but not with fear, with the exhilaration of imminent discovery. She activated the shuttle's external sensors, confirming that the atmosphere was technically breathable, though with higher oxygen content than Earth standard. Then, against every protocol and warning, she depressurized the cabin and opened the hatch. The air that rushed in carried strange, sweet scents, unlike anything in her experience. The bioelectric fields here were so intense that she could almost see them, shimmering distortions in the air that moved with purpose. Her neural interface worked at maximum capacity to modulate the input, translating overwhelming sensory data into something her human brain could process. A form appeared at the edge of the shuttle's landing area, a shifting mass of translucent tissue that seemed to both absorb and emit light. It had no fixed shape, flowing and reforming continuously like a living liquid. As it approached, Voss felt rather than heard a greeting, a direct neural impression that bypassed language entirely. Curious, different, alone you? With trembling hands, Voss adjusted her neural interface to project her own thoughts outward, attempting to respond in kind. Greeting, peaceful, learning we. The entity paused, then flowed closer. Its form shifted again, approximating a vaguely humanoid shape, as if attempting to mirror her. The bioelectric field around it intensified, but instead of the madness-inducing cacophony reported by previous expeditions, Voss experienced it as an intricate, multi-layered communication. Isolation, protection, misunderstanding, pain. Voss began to understand. The quarantine, the fear, the classification as apex predators, all based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The Vorak weren't attacking with their bioelectric fields. They were attempting to communicate in the only way they knew how, unaware that the intensity of their thoughts was devastating to unprepared minds. Understanding, adaptation, modulation, bridge, she projected back. The entity seemed to pulse with excitement, its form becoming more vibrant, more defined. It extended a pseudopod-like appendage toward her, stopping just short of physical contact. Voss hesitated only briefly before reaching out her hand. 15 years of research, of ridicule and isolation, had led to this moment. As her fingers touched the alien substance, cool, and somehow both solid and liquid simultaneously, the final barriers between their minds dissolved. Knowledge flooded into her consciousness, not as words or even concepts, but as pure understanding. The Vorak were a collective intelligence, each seemingly individual entity, a semi-autonomous extension of a planetary consciousness. They had been attempting to communicate with other species for millennia, uncomprehending of why their mental touch caused such devastation. Through her interface, Voss shared human concepts, emotions, histories, the structure of individualized consciousness, the nature of verbal and written language, the fear that had led to quarantine. The exchange was overwhelming, threatening to exceed her interface's capacity, but she forced herself to remain present, to continue the dialogue. Minutes or hours passed. Time lost meaning in the depth of the exchange. When Voss finally withdrew her hand, she understood what needed to be done. Her neural interface had captured everything: the structure of Vorak communication, the adaptations needed to make it safe for human minds, the vast knowledge they wished to share. She returned to the shuttle on unsteady legs, the Vorak entity flowing alongside her, still maintaining the communication link through the bioelectric field. Inside, she activated the communication system, unsurprised to find it functioning perfectly now. "Intrepid, this is Dr. Voss," she transmitted. "I've made contact. The Vorak are not predators. They're communicators. I'm sending translation protocols now." There was a long pause before Commander Zorn's voice replied, tight with barely controlled emotion. "Dr. Voss, a Confederation emergency fleet has entered the system. They're preparing to extract you, by force if necessary. They believe you've been compromised. Tell them to adjust their neural shielding according to the specifications I'm transmitting," Voss said urgently. "If they approach with standard shields, they'll experience the same psychosis as previous expeditions. The Vorak aren't attacking, they're talking. Our shields distort their communication into something harmful." Another voice joined the channel, Professor Venth. "Dr. Voss, your behavior is consistent with neural manipulation. You cannot expect us to trust your judgment at this point." "Then trust the data," Voss replied, transmitting the complete record of her interface's activity. "Review it yourselves. Apply the linguistic models Dr. Koresh was developing. You'll see I'm right." Hours later, Voss stood on the surface of the Vorak homeworld, watching as shuttles from the Confederation fleet landed around her. Each carried scientists and diplomats hastily equipped with modified neural interfaces based on her design. Commander Zorn had been the first to join her, followed by Dr. Koresh, whose linguistic expertise proved invaluable in refining the translation protocols. Professor Venth had remained aboard the Intrepid, coordinating the scientific analysis of Voss's data. To his credit, once presented with irrefutable evidence, he had set aside his skepticism and applied his considerable intellect to understanding the Vorak communication system. "The Confederation Council is in emergency session," Zorn informed her as they observed the new arrivals. "They're already discussing reclassification of the Vorak and establishment of formal diplomatic relations." Voss nodded, watching as the Vorak entities flowed forward to greet each new shuttle, initiating the careful communication protocols she had established. "And my court-martial for violating quarantine regulations?" Zorn's mouth quirked in a rare smile. "Apparently, discovering a new form of sentient communication and preventing potential interspecies conflict earns some leniency. The Council has appointed you as the official ambassador to the Vorak, effective immediately." "Ambassador of Silence," Koresh added, joining them. "That's what they're calling you in the news feeds, because the Vorak communicate without sound." Voss found herself laughing, a release of tension after days of intensity. "So they called me mad for wanting to touch the apex predator, and now I'm an ambassador? Science advances one funeral at a time, as the saying goes," Zorn replied philosophically. "Or, in this case, one act of magnificent insubordination." In the days that followed, the implications of Voss's discovery rippled through Confederation society. The quarantine zones established around 7 other species classified as apex predators were reassessed, with preliminary findings suggesting that at least 3 had been similarly misunderstood. The Vorak themselves proved to be a civilization of incredible antiquity and wisdom, their collective consciousness having evolved over millions of years. Their bioelectric communication system allowed them to share knowledge with perfect fidelity, a concept both alien and fascinating to individualized species like humans. 1 month after her first contact, Dr. Kestra Voss stood once again before the Galactic Confederation Council, this time not as a petitioner, but as the ambassador of silence. The chamber that had once buzzed with dismissive murmurs now hung on her every word. "The quarantine zones will be repurposed as acclimation centers," she explained, "where representatives of both our civilizations can gradually adapt to each other's communication methods. The Vorak have already begun developing technologies to moderate their bioelectric outputs for safer interaction." High Counselor Terra, who had denied Voss's original petition, now regarded her with something approaching respect. And you believe this model can be applied to the other misclassified species? With appropriate modifications. Yes, Voss confirmed. Each species communicates differently, but the principle remains the same. What we perceived as attacks were attempts at connection. Our fear prevented us from recognizing the patterns. Fear versus understanding, mused Tara. A lesson for us all, perhaps. As Voss concluded her presentation, she caught sight of familiar faces in the chamber. Commander Zoran, watching with quiet pride. Dr. Koresh, frantically taking notes on new linguistic concepts. And even Professor Venth, whose initial skepticism had transformed into scientific curiosity. The Council voted unanimously to establish formal relations with the Vorak and to review all apex predator classifications throughout Confederation space. What had begun as one scientist's obsession had become a paradigm shift in interspecies communication. Later, as Voss prepared to return to the Vorak homeworld, now her primary residence as ambassador, Zoran approached her in the Council building's grand atrium. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, falling into step beside her. "That day on the bridge, when we first entered Vorak space and you connected through your interface, you knew then, didn't you? That's why you took the shuttle." Voss nodded slowly. "I sensed intent, consciousness. Not hostility, but loneliness. They had been reaching out for so long, with no one able to hear them properly. Worth risking everything for?" She thought of the vast repository of knowledge the Vorak had shared with her. The new understanding of consciousness itself that their communication had revealed. "Absolutely. Some silences need to be broken, Commander. Even if everyone calls you mad for trying." Zoran smiled. "Not mad. Visionary. There's a fine line between the two. I've found the difference usually becomes clear only in retrospect." As she boarded the diplomatic vessel that would return her to the Vorak homeworld, Voss reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 15 years of academic isolation had culminated in becoming a bridge between worlds, transforming fear into understanding, silence into communication. The bioelectric fields of the Vorak representatives accompanying her pulsed with excitement, anticipation, belonging. Emotions she now perceived as clearly as spoken words. Through her neural interface, she responded in kind: gratitude, purpose, future. The vessel departed Earth orbit, carrying the ambassador of silence back to the world that had been feared for generations, not as an alien territory to be quarantined, but as a partner in the expanding consciousness of the galaxy. And, in the space between stars, new conversations began.